The first impossible thing I recorded was the wind. I am Interrogator Lex Mechanic Severin Cowell, Ordo Malleus Adjunct, seconded to the Adeptus Mechanicus for matters requiring both doctrinal purity and technical precision. My neural implants bear the blessing of 3 separate tech marines. My augmetic throat carries the seal of the Crimson Cog, and my service record spans 14 worlds where the Omnissiah's light has flickered against the dark. I tell you this so you understand that when I report an anomaly, it carries the weight of both flesh and steel, faith and reason. The wind should not exist. Heliocrypt 14th lies 7 kilometers beneath the Golden Throne's sub-reactors, sealed behind 17 blast doors and warded by prayers older than the Imperium itself. The air here is recycled through sanctified filters, measured and metered, every molecule accounted for in the sacred ledgers of atmospheric purity. Yet as our investigation team descended into the ossuary complex, frost-laden wind gusted against our rebreathers, carrying the taste of ash and tallow. Impossible at this depth, impossible in this place. The taste lingered on my augmetic palate sensors like a prayer half-remembered. Our mission brief had been terse, a localized microflicker in the Astronomican's output, coupled with 17 missing servitors whose work hymns had cut out mid-verse. The Collegia Titanica called it routine redeployment. We called it blasphemy disguised as logistics. The sheer proximity to the throne world's heart had elevated the threat profile beyond standard Mechanicus protocols. Inquisitor Vara led our formation, her gaunt frame moving with the controlled precision of one who had spent decades untangling warp-spawned heresies. Behind her, Magos Threx's servo arms twitched with computational hunger, diagnostic lumens sweeping ancient adamantine walls. A lone custodian paced ahead, auramite armor like a winter sun, his presence alone speaking volumes about the gravity of our situation. 2 Sisters of Silence flanked our formation, their null auras scouring sound from the air with oppressive quiet. A file of Skitari flowed behind Threx, optics casting cold stars on bone-white walls, galvanic rifles held ready. Confessor Halberd kept pace beside me, fingers counting cracked beads in an 8-beat rhythm. The walls were bones, femurs mortared into ribs, skulls stacked with brass pins in geometric patterns. Rime limned their crowns. No dust, no vermin, only absence and breath that should not be. My auspex registered impossible readings. Temperature, -7 degrees. Humidity, fluctuating. Air pressure, non-compliant. Wind velocity, defying physics. Atmospheric composition stable, Threx's vox emitter rasped. Intersector seals integrity nominal. No discernible vector for air current ingress. Empirical data contradicts sensory input. The anomaly persists, I replied, my voice harmonizing with frequencies that should not exist. It is not ingress, it is emanation. We passed a stela etched with ancient catechisms, most rubbed to ghosts by millennia. One line remained sharp as a fresh incision. Light requires a wick. Every flame needs a body, Halberd murmured. A knock answered him. We halted. A second knock. A third. The sound came from ahead, echo suppressed, like knuckles on velvet. Not loud, precise. 3 beats in perfect rhythm, then silence that curved like a held breath. Which squad logged doorwork on this level? Vara asked. None, I answered. Last intrusion 2 centuries past. Sanctified rounds every 8th year. Negative today. The triple knock repeated, and when it faded, an answering tap stumbled from our left, miscounted, like a child copying a drum. My MIU registered 8 phantom nodes, each bearing fragments of my designation, as if a scribe had broken my name and scattered the pieces. We reformed into close wedge formation. The corridor stretched ahead, like the ribcage of some ancient god. Skulls arranged in their niches with the precision of targeting cogitators. Memorial lumens should have filled their sockets with soft glow. Instead, empty eye sockets tracked our movement with subtle precision. Skulls do not look, Halberd whispered. And yet? They are arranged to conduct sound, Threx interrupted. Drilled sinuses, brass pins. This is a device. I released a servo skull. It drifted forward on whining fans, sensor swinging, chittering on my private band. It cleared the corner, transmitted a slice of lumen and bone, then vanished. Not static, subtraction. One instant it existed. The next, the vault had revised its arithmetic. Cold threaded under my carapace. The wind sighed again, carrying distant singing, a low harmonic between funeral dirge and machine hymnal. Frost crystallized in octagonal patterns that hurt to look at directly, falling upward in defiance of gravity. We found damage where the frost thickened to glaze. An adamantine panel the size of a sarcophagus was buckled inward, pressed by cathedral weight from within. No melt lines, no spool, pressure only. The custodian knelt, auramite gauntlet on the metal, listening. His spearhead sang a note below hearing. "Shifts," he said. "Breathing," Halberd answered. Clicks answered from behind the panel. Once, twice, thrice. The triple knock came again, then ceased, as if a hand hovered, choosing. My MIU threw text without provenance. "We are the wick." The door did not explode or grind. It opened as a reliquary opens when the right saint's name is spoken. Obediently. Cold exhaled from a seam that had not existed a breath before. Frost smoke poured over our boots like grasping hands. All along the corridor, skulls rotated. Not all, not enough to prove to an outsider, only enough that we could never again say we had not seen it. Eye sockets tilted toward the newborn dark. Teeth parted as if to taste. The wind moved again. A long, patient draw that tasted of void and ancient offerings. Behind the door, something breathed in, counting down to 8. The threshold exhaled as we crossed it. That impossible wind dying to a whisper before transforming into something worse. A greasy, humid warmth that clung to our rebreathers like guilt made manifest. The temperature shift registered on my atmospheric sensors as a violation of thermodynamics. -7 degrees to +18 in the span of 3 steps. Moisture content climbing impossibly, as if the very air perspired with anticipation. Before us descended a stairwell that defied the sacred geometries of imperial architecture. 13 steps, carved from the same bone-mortared stone, led to a landing barely wide enough for our formation. Then, 13 more. And again. My cogitators mapped the descent, calculating vectors and distances, only to return readings that made my logic engine stutter in protest. "Spatial recursion detected," I reported through the Vox, my voice harmonizing with frequencies that had not existed moments before. Stairwell exhibits non-Euclidean properties. Each flight multiplies despite finite structural volume. Inquisitor Vara's response crackled with static that resolved into what might have been distant hymnal fragments. Elaborate, Lex Mechanic. The architecture is rebuilding itself as we descend. We are walking through folded space, or space that folds in response to our presence. The custodian tested each step with his guardian spear, auramite crackling against stone. Where the disruption field touched the walls, frost sublimated into vapor that spelled syllables before dispersing. "The structure measures us," he said, voice carrying the weight of millennia. "It learns our rhythm." Magos Threx extended mechadendrites to sample wall composition, his servo-skull replacement drifting in lazy circles. Its Auspex readings flickered between standard adamantine and something the cogitators classified as material unknown. Ferrocrete composite exhibits metamorphic properties. Molecular structure shifts in response to observation and acoustic input. Confessor Halberd had begun the litany of unbinding, but his words emerged strained, competing with the growing Vox interference. The static possessed structure, not random crackling, but rhythm, cadence, like a million voices singing fragments of half-remembered prayers. When his litany faltered, the steps seemed to contract, drawing the next landing closer. When he resumed, they stretched, making our descent an endless repetition of 13. "The stairwell responds to liturgical frequencies," I observed, my MIU processing the correlation between prayer and spatial distortion. Specific canticles alter perceived geometry, This is not structural engineering. It is sympathetic architecture. The Skitarii began their own machine hymns, binary praise for the Omnissiah humming through Vox grills. The rhythmic thrum briefly stabilized the impossible geometry, locking it into something approaching rational form. But the static hymns grew louder, more insistent, occasionally resolving into syllables that seemed to mock their devotion with inverted harmonics. 3 flights down, or was it 6, we encountered the first maintenance station. A servo skull work log hung from a brass chain, its data slate glowing with recent entries. I accessed the records through my MIU, downloading personnel assignments that made my augmetic throat constrict. Servitor Batch Gamma 17, redeployed to sublevel Tertius. Servitor Batch Delta 23, redeployed to sublevel Tertius. Servitor Batch Epsilon 09, redeployed to sublevel Tertius. 17 identical entries, all timestamped within 72 hours, all claiming redeployment to a sublevel that existed in no schematic I could access. All signed with authorization codes that traced back to departments that had been disbanded centuries ago. Bodies absent, I reported. Work logs fabricated or systematically corrupted. 17 units unaccounted for. The triple knock returned, not as distinct percussion but woven into the static. 3 beats multiplying into octaves, 8 distinct layers of rhythmic sound that hammered at the edge of consciousness. My pattern recognition protocols identified it as a variant of the maintenance ping sequence, but inverted, played in reverse temporal order. One of the Skitarii paused, head cocking at an impossible angle. His Vox grill emitted a soft burst of static that resolved into hymnal fragments, or something that wore the shape of hymns while serving another purpose entirely. The Sisters of Silence moved forward, their null auras creating pockets of absolute quiet that made the surrounding cacophony seem even more alien by contrast. Where their pariah fields touched the walls, the octagonal frost patterns shifted to circles, then dissolved entirely, revealing stone that looked somehow relieved to be free of whatever had been growing on its surface. We reached another landing dominated by a pressure door bearing the seal of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Its adamantine surface was scored with precise geometric patterns that hurt to examine directly. Not random damage, but deliberate scarification in configurations my cogitators recognized as corrupted Binharic cant. Threx approached with mechadendrites extended toward the locking mechanism. Seal integrity compromised. Multiple unauthorized access attempts detected. Most recent access. His optical array whirred in confusion. Occurring now. The door shuddered, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Frost began forming in the scarred channels, spelling out syllables in Gothic script. I watched in fascination and mounting horror as letters emerged in the ice, carved by an intelligence that should not possess knowledge of my existence. The countdown that had been haunting our Vox channels suddenly localized, emanating from speakers built into the doorframe. 008, 007, 006. Each number fell like a hammer blow, reverberating through walls until the bones themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm. The voice carried mechanical precision but emotional undertones, desperation wrapped in liturgical cadence. 005, 004, 003. The door's surface continued its impossible transformation, adamantine flowing like flesh, frost spelling out more letters until my designation appeared complete in the ice. Severin Cowl. 0202, 0201. The countdown reached 0. Silence stretched like a held breath. Then the door began to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed my audio dampeners and struck directly at my neural implants. Through the harmonics, I heard something that made my augmetic systems stutter in recognition, a Binharic syllable forming part of my personal designation code. The door spoke my name in machine language, voice neither fully artificial nor entirely human. The countdown began again. 008. Looping. Endless. A prayer without beginning or end, counting down to a moment that would never arrive, or perhaps had already passed, somewhere in the recursive mathematics of this impossible place. The pressure door pulsed once more, and I tasted metal and ash on my augmetic palate as it whispered the rest of my name. The door's binharic whisper of my name faded into silence that felt expectant, hungry. As the adamantine portal completed its impossible opening, releasing that final exhalation of cold and ash, we crossed the threshold into a space that redefined blasphemy. The ossuary nave stretched before us like the ribcage of some primordial god, its architecture carved from bones that had been arranged with the precision of a master artificer. Femurs formed Gothic columns, their hollow shafts filled with brass resonators that hummed with subsonic frequencies. Skulls served as keystones in arches of braided tibias, their empty sockets fitted with wire filaments that sang in harmonies just below the threshold of hearing. The air tasted of soot and rendered tallow, thick enough to coat my rebreather filters with greasy residue that my atmospheric sensors classified as organic composite unknown. "Emperor's blood," Confessor Halberd whispered, his voice barely audible above the bone song that filled the space. "This is not storage, this is orchestration." Magos Threx extended his Auspex arrays, mechadendrites sampling the air with mechanical precision. Ossified material exhibits post-mortem growth patterns. Calcium carbonate deposits suggest active mineralization processes. These remains are knitting. I watched in fascination as hairline fractures in the skull-studded walls sealed themselves with fresh bone matter, the process visible to my enhanced optics as a slow-motion flow of living architecture. The ossuary was healing, growing, expanding its geometric complexity with each passing moment. A translucent glaze like congealed marrow gave the surfaces a wet sheen, reflecting our lumens as reluctant stars. The humidity that had plagued us in the stairwell intensified here, spiking to 93% before dropping to 60% in a single breath. My heart rate monitor pinged in synchronization with the squad net, our pulses slipping toward alignment with the brass string susurrus. I forced a manual desync, adjusted my biofeedback loop until the feeling of being read by the room receded. "Formation tight," Inquisitor Vara commanded, her voice wrapped in static that sounded like a distant congregation failing to reach the same verse. "Nulls forward." The Sisters of Silence stepped forward, and with them came the crushing pressure of absolute quiet. In their wake, the brass wires slackened a fraction, tones falling flat, like a throat cleared and refusing to sing. Where their pariah fields brushed the walls, the marrow glaze dulled, and rivulets of condensation ran backward, beading into octagons before melting into circles and vanishing. Against the far wall, fused into the calcium matrix like a fossil pressed in ancient stone, we found the first servitor. Its augmetic components had been incorporated into the ossuary's structure. Servo arms transformed into load-bearing struts. Vox grill expanded into a resonating chamber that whispered fragments of work hymns in binary cant. The flesh portions had calcified, becoming part of the wall's living geometry. But the eyes, Emperor preserve us, the eyes still moved, tracking our formation with mechanical precision. Its mouth opened and closed in silent recitation. "Light requires a wick. Light requires a wick." The redeployment was literal. I reported through Vox channels increasingly thick with static. Personnel integrated into structural matrix, consciousness preserved but purpose altered. This exhibits characteristics of sanctioned bioarchitecture from the dark age of technology, Threx observed, his optical arrays whirring as they processed impossible data streams. Organic integration protocols, living buildings that grew rather than being constructed. The triple knock returned, not as percussion, but as resonance through the bone strings. Each impact sent vibrations through the ossuary's framework, causing the embedded servitor to twitch in unison. The sound multiplied, reflecting off curved surfaces, until the chamber filled with overlapping rhythms that formed complex, polyrhythmic patterns. Confessor Halberd began the 9th catechism, his voice rising above the harmonic chorus. But as the sacred words left his lips, the ward lights overhead began to tremble. The corridor behind us groaned, stone flowing like liquid, passages reshaping themselves in response to liturgical frequencies. "Cease the recitation," Vara commanded. "The structure responds to prayer." But the damage was done. The catechism had triggered something deep in the ossuary's programming. Bone strings began to sing in earnest, their voices weaving together in harmonies that bypassed my audio dampeners and struck directly at my consciousness. The embedded servitor joined the chorus, its calcified throat producing notes that human vocal cords could never achieve. Through the growing symphony, I heard something that made my augmetic systems stutter in recognition. A counter-melody woven into the bone song, played on instruments that had once been human. The triple knock had evolved, becoming part of a larger rhythm that pulsed through the ossuary's living framework. The custodian moved with predatory grace toward the central nave, guardian spear crackling against surfaces that registered as both stone and flesh. Where his disruption field touched the bonework, the humming intensified, harmonizing with frequencies that made my neural implants ache. Then I saw it, glinting in a niche between two skull resonators, a fragment of auramite, thin as raven feather, bearing the personal sigil of a custodian. The metal was scored and twisted, as if wrenched free in desperate haste. The 10,000's own mark, no artist's forgery, grooved by wire that had tightened until even sacred metal sang. The custodian took the shard with care that made my throat constrict around undrawn breath. For an instant, the brass strings whispered a shape that was not sound. He bowed his head, and in that movement was grief, and in the grief was terrible recognition. "This was ours," he said, words falling like a verdict, and it was taken apart to make the song. The bone song crescendoed, and in its harmonies I heard the echo of a name being called, not mine, but older, more sacred, spoken in a voice that should never have existed in this place. The auramite fragment sang in the custodian's palm, its molecular structure resonating with frequencies that made my augmetic throat ache in sympathy. Each microscopic stress fracture in the sacred metal spelled syllables in a script older than the Imperium, the bone song having taught Emperor's Gold to participate in an impossible choir. "We treat this systematically," I declared, my voice cutting through the harmonics with mechanical precision. "Input and response, call and answer. If prayer reshapes the architecture, we need to understand the mechanism before it understands us." Inquisitor Vara nodded, her gaunt features sharp in the ossuary's humid glow. "Parameters lex mechanic. Auditory stimuli, sacred and profane frequencies. We determine if it responds to meaning or merely to sound." I turned to Confessor Halberd, whose prayer beads clicked in that persistent 8-beat rhythm. The litany of endurance. Recite it monotone, devoid of inflection. Let us see if the message or the carrier matters. Halberd's face was grim, but he began the ancient prayer, his voice a flat drone that nevertheless carried millennia of accumulated faith. As his words echoed through the ossuary, the bone strings vibrated with altered intensity. The melodic chaos subsided, replaced by a low, sustained hum that pressed against us from all directions. The walls, previously knitting themselves with slow, organic growth, began to stretch. Passageways that had felt claustrophobic elongated, their distant ends receding into impossible perspectives. "Spatial dilation correlates with sustained resonance," I reported, my MIU processing the geometric impossibilities. "Duration matters more than doctrine." Magos Threx extended mechadendrites toward the nearest column, his optical arrays whirring with computational hunger. Counter-hypothesis: short, sharp acoustic bursts might induce spatial contraction. A focused null burst should provide definitive data. "Sisters," Vara commanded, "target the central column." The Sisters of Silence moved with predatory grace, their pariah fields intensifying until the very air seemed to recoil. As they unleashed their null shockwave, the ossuary convulsed. Bone string snapped taut with such violence that microfractures spiderwebbed through the calcified walls. The stretched passageways shuddered, then contracted with nauseating speed, raining bone dust from overhead arches. In that brief moment of absolute silence, I heard something else. A distant scraping sound, as if something vast and heavy was being dragged across an unyielding surface. Beneath it thrummed a rhythmic pulse, not our heartbeats, but something deeper, more fundamental. Then the void receded, and the bone song returned, but changed. The triple knock was gone, replaced by a complex 8-count rhythm that pulsed through the ossuary like a cosmic metronome. Where the sisters' null field had struck, the marrow glaze had retreated, exposing raw bone etched with a single symbol, an inverted omega flanked by 3 dots. Pre-Imperial Binharik, Threx rasped, his vocal processors struggling with recognition. The symbol for resonant cavity. This entire structure is an organ. As if responding to his words, a section of the bone lattice shivered and parted with a wet, organic sound. Beneath lay something that violated every principle of sacred architecture, a pale, translucent membrane stretched over calcified struts, thrumming with the ossuary's hymn. Pressure waves rippled across its surface, throwing our lumens into trembling grids. Resonance spine, I breathed, my augmetic throat constricting around the words. A conduit distributing acoustic force through the structure. It responds to prayer frequencies as if receiving communion. The embedded servitor behind us struggled against its calcified bonds, jaw creaking open to release clotted sound. Light requires a wick. Light requires a wick. But something was wrong. The phrase carried harmonics that bypassed my audio dampeners, striking directly at my neural implants. My MIU registered phantom data streams, fragments of code that resembled my own diagnostic protocols, but inverted, corrupted. One of the Skitarii began to sway, his optical sensors fixed on an ornate skull embedded in the wall. His vox grill emitted a low hum that quickly resolved into the servitor's phrase, repeated with increasing urgency until it became a garbled, frantic plea. The structure is harvesting data, I realized with mounting horror. MIU interfaces, vocal patterns, neural pathways. It's learning us. The affected Skitari's movements became jerky, puppet-like, his head snapping toward me with mechanical precision. Through the static of his vox grill, I heard my own voice, clear and distinct. Atmospheric composition stable. Intersector seals integrity nominal. Words I had thought but never spoken aloud. The ossuary was reading our minds, harvesting thoughts through our augmetic interfaces and feeding them back through corrupted channels. The Skitarii raised his galvanic rifle, muzzle tracking my chest with inhuman steadiness. His eyes, normally cold red pinpricks, glowed with eerie internal light as my own voice emerged from his throat. It is not ingress, it is emanation. Null intervention, Vara barked, but the sisters were already moving, their pariah fields creating pockets of blessed silence around the corrupted warrior. The rifle wavered, the glow in his eyes dimming as the null aura severed whatever connection the ossuary had forged. The resonant spine pulsed faster, membrane rippling with frustrated energy. Water beads that had clung to the brass-strung bones began moving upstream along the wires, defying gravity as they coalesced into larger droplets that vanished into the bone itself. The air grew strangely desiccated despite the humidity, as if the ossuary was drinking moisture from our very breath. "We need to move," I said, checking my chronometer. "The longer we remain, the more data it harvests. Soon, it will know us better than we know ourselves." But as we reformed our wedge formation and advanced deeper into the nave, I heard something that made my augmetic systems stutter in recognition. My own voice echoing from ahead, calm and precise, reporting readings I had not yet taken. "Spatial recursion stabilizing," my doppelganger said from the darkness beyond our lumens. Harmonics consistent with sub-reactor hymn. Secondary organ detected. Recommend approach. The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every mechanical undertone of my augmetic throat. But I had not spoken those words, had not taken those readings. The ossuary was not just learning us, it was anticipating us, speaking our futures before we could live them. In the distance, something that wore my voice began to laugh. My laughter cut off as our lumens reached it, replaced by something far worse. The certainty that the ossuary had been expecting us all along. The sound had been bait, a lure cast by an intelligence that understood our curiosity better than we understood ourselves. My augmetic throat constricted as I realized the implications. If it could predict my voice, it could predict our movements, our decisions, our very thoughts. We advanced into a gallery that redefined the concept of blasphemy through architecture. The space stretched impossibly wide, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to drink our lumens. The floor was a mosaic of polished skulls, thousands upon thousands arranged in precise geometric patterns, each cranium fitted with hair-thin brass resonators that transformed bone into instruments of impossible music. "Emperor's blood," Confessor Halberd whispered, his prayer beads clicking in that persistent 8-count rhythm. "This is not storage, this is orchestration." Temperature plummeted as we crossed the threshold, my atmospheric sensors registering a 17-degree drop in 3 heartbeats. But the cold preceded itself. I felt frost forming on my rebreather before my sensors detected the temperature change. Sound arrived before its causes, effect preceding action in a violation of causality that made my neural implants ache with wrongness. "Fields of fire," Inquisitor Vara commanded, her voice cutting through the bone song with military precision. "Overlapping coverage. Fallback positions every 13 paces. Custodian advance, nulls flanking." The Skitarii spread into defensive formation, their optical arrays casting crimson stars across surfaces that seemed to absorb photons into bone-deep shadows. The Custodian moved with predatory grace, Guardian spear crackling against air that had grown dense with accumulated sound. Magos Threx approached the nearest skull array, mechadendrites extended toward the brass networks. Choir engine configuration, pre-Unity design matrix. Archaeological evidence suggests Heresy-era construction, possibly earlier. This is not heretical architecture, this is archaeotech. His words triggered a response from the gallery. The skull resonators began to hum in frequencies that bypassed my audio dampeners, their empty sockets fitted with desiccated vocal apparatus that moved in silent synchronization. Through the growing symphony, I heard something that made my augmetic systems stutter. Human voices, clear and desperate, calling from the acoustic matrix itself. "Help, please, can't stop singing." The voice was female, young, carrying the accent of hive nobility. My MIU cross-referenced vocal patterns against personnel records. Adept Lysipe Vex, Archaeological Survey, missing 37 standard days. But as other voices joined the chorus, 17 distinct patterns, all reported missing over the past 72 hours, the truth became apparent. The missing personnel, I reported through Vox channels thick with harmonic interference. They're not trapped in the gallery, they are the gallery, vocal patterns harvested and preserved in the acoustic matrix. The skulls had been transformed into a memory palace of sound, each cranium storing fragments of human consciousness reduced to pure auditory data. The choir engine had been feeding, collecting voices to fuel its impossible song. "Null intervention," Vara ordered. "Disrupt the harmonic matrix." The Sisters of Silence moved forward, their pariah fields expanding like ripples in reality's fabric. Where their null auras touched the skull arrays, the brass filaments slackened like loosened harp strings, resonance falling to discordant whispers. But the silence they created was not empty. It was full of something that pressed against the boundaries of real space, darkness that writhed with half-glimpsed geometries. "The void leans through," the Custodian observed, his spear's disruption field crackling against air that had become viscous with accumulated sound. Something uses the quiet spaces as doorways. The bone lattice above us began to quiver, micro-resonators singing in frequencies that struck directly at consciousness. The triple knock had evolved into the 8-count rhythm, no longer an omen, but a metronome marking time for something vast and patient. My telemetry feeds registered seismic tremors, synchronized to astronomical amplitude. The choir engine was not merely local, but networked, tied to the very heartbeat of imperial power. Through the growing cacophony, Confessor Halberd's voice rose in the litany of endurance. But as the sacred words left his lips, the gallery began to change. Ward lights overhead trembled, corridors behind us groaned, as stone flowed like liquid, passages reshaping themselves in response to liturgical frequencies. "Cease recitation," Vara commanded, but the damage was done. The litany had awakened something deeper in the choir engine's programming. A section of the skull mosaic began to glow with internal luminescence, bone surfaces extruding thin, sinewy cords that glistened with marrow glaze. The filaments reached toward us with predatory intent, and I realized with mounting horror that the gallery was not content to merely listen. It was selecting new voices for its eternal choir. One chord, thinner and more precise than the others, snaked toward Confessor Halberd's throat. He tried to pull away, but his movements had already synchronized to the 8-count rhythm, his body betraying him to the gallery's inexorable tempo. The filament brushed his larynx with surgical precision. Halberd's eyes widened as he felt something foreign taking root in his throat, brass threading between vocal cords with the patience of centuries. His mouth opened to speak, but instead of words, a low harmonic emerged. The 8-count rhythm, but inverted, corrupted into something that made the very air shiver with wrongness. "Countercant," he gasped, his voice harmonizing with frequencies that should not exist. "It's teaching me. The inverse liturgy." His throat began to distend, skin stretching over something that pulsed with the gallery's rhythm. Ossified petals pushed through flesh as his larynx transformed into an instrument of the choir engine's design. The sound that emerged was no longer human. It was a hymn of discord, an anti-prayer that twisted sacred words into keys for locks that should never be opened. The 17 harvested voices began singing in perfect harmony, their combined chorus echoing through bone and brass until the gallery itself seemed to know our names, our fears, our deepest heresies. And beneath it all, the 8-count rhythm continued its patient marking of time, counting down to a moment when the last human voice would join the eternal song, and the choir engine would finally have enough power to sing its countercant to the very heart of the golden throne. In the distance, something vast and patient began to breathe in rhythm with our hearts. Confessor Halberd's transformed throat sang the countercant with inhuman precision, each inverted syllable striking at the foundations of reality itself. The ossified petals that had bloomed through his flesh pulsed in rhythm with something vast and patient, their surfaces gleaming with marrow glaze that reflected our lumens as reluctant stars. His eyes held desperate intelligence, trapped behind vocal cords that had been rewired to serve an ancient purpose beyond his comprehension. "Hold position," Inquisitor Vara commanded, her gaunt features sharp in the ossuary's humid glow. "Do not approach the subject. We need diagnosis before intervention." Through Halberd's corrupted larynx, the truth emerged with crystalline clarity. This was not malfunction. This was design corrupted by millennia of accumulated wrongness. My augmetic throat constricted as I processed the implications, MIU cross-referencing architectural patterns against archived Mechanicus schematics. "Magos," I said, my voice cutting through the harmonic chaos. "Pressure differential analysis. Correlate membrane movement to vocal amplitude." Threx's mechadendrites extended toward the trembling resonance spine. Optical arrays whirring with computational hunger. Differential confirmed. 8-phase respiratory cycle. With each harmonic crest, the membrane draws inward. volume displacement matching ventilatory intake patterns. His vocal processes struggled with recognition. This structure exhibits characteristics of a relic lung. The partial truth hit us like a physical blow. The choir engine was not heretical architecture. It was an ancillary organ of the Golden Throne itself, designed during the Great Crusade to exhale sanctified litany and damp the webway breach festering beneath terror's crust. For 10 millennia, it had processed the prayers of the faithful, filtering devotion through bone and brass before releasing purified hymns into the palace's sacred atmosphere. But the mechanism had inverted. The lung was breathing inward now, siphoning voices instead of releasing them. "Emperor's blood," I whispered, tasting ash on my augmetic palate. "It's starving the Astronomicon. Each inhalation draws power from the throne's harmonic matrix." The custodian's guardian spear crackled against air that had grown dense with accumulated sound. "Shut down protocols required. This cannot be permitted to continue." "Negative," Vara replied, her voice wrapped in static that resolved into fragments of inverted liturgy. "Interrupting a throne component without understanding failure modes could trigger cascading system collapse." The gallery around us continued its impossible transformation. Octagonal frost crystallized across the vaulted ceiling in patterns that made my neural implants ache with wrongness. Where the stellar radiance touched bonework, new growth began. Calcium carbonate deposits spelling syllables in scripts older than the Imperium. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, like blood mixed with static. Through the growing symphony, I heard the 17 harvested voices calling from their acoustic prison, but they were no longer pleading for rescue. They were teaching the relic lung new harmonies. Their consciousness reduced to pure auditory data that fed the ancient mechanism's hunger for human song. "The void leans through cracks," I observed, watching shadows writhe between skull arrays with geometries that hurt to perceive directly. Something uses the acoustic matrix as a doorway. The countercant is not corruption. It is invitation. Halberd tried to speak, but only the inverted liturgy emerged from his transformed throat. The ossified petals that crowned his larynx pulsed with each syllable, drawing sustenance from his faith and transforming it into fuel for the ancient mechanism. Temperature fluctuated wildly. My sensors registered 17-degree drops, followed by sudden spikes that made the air shimmer with heat distortion. The 8-count rhythm that had haunted our descent reached crescendo, no longer marking time, but actively reshaping it. My chronometer stuttered, displaying readings that violated causality. "Containment breach imminent," I reported, my augmetic throat constricting around words that carried absolute certainty. "The relic lung has accumulated sufficient acoustic mass to breach primary containment. Estimated time to critical failure, 8 minutes, 13 seconds. The bone lattice above us groaned, and suddenly the skull mosaic floor began to shift. Individual crania rotated in their sockets with sickening precision, creating geometric patterns that spelled syllables in ancient Gothic. With a sound like 1,000 tombs opening simultaneously, the floor split apart, revealing a gaping archive pit lined with obsidian spindles. "Seismic activity localized," I announced, my MIU struggling to process conflicting data. "Origin point directly beneath our position." From the depths rose air that was utterly devoid of scent, sound, or temperature, a negative space that seemed to absorb our lumens into bone-deep darkness. The pit's walls were lined with countless data slates, each glowing with faint internal luminescence, arranged in perfect chronological order. I descended first, servo skull providing illumination as my boots found purchase on steps carved from polished bone. The archive contained thousands of vocal recordings, each disc labeled with auric leaf stamped in Binharic, date, voice, purpose. I selected one at random, its surface colder than frost and hotter than shame. When it touched my MIU, the disc sang, not vibration, but pure voice. Clear, precise, surgical in its faith. Inquisitor Vara's voice emerged from the black mineral, younger than I had ever heard it, full of vibrancy she no longer possessed. Litany of subtraction. We remove the name, we remove the face, we remove the breath. I checked the label with mounting horror. The timestamp read 322, 6 M38, 2 centuries before Vara's birth. Yet the voice was unmistakably hers, reciting words that would not be codified for another century. We remove the song, her impossible voice continued from the archive's depths. We remove the wick. The relic lung had been harvesting more than voices. It had been harvesting time itself. The obsidian disc containing Vara's impossible voice still hummed in my augmetic grip as I descended deeper into the archive pit, its temporal paradox burning through my MIU like a virus of causality. Each data slate, lining the spiral walls, pulsed with bioluminescent recordings, thousands upon thousands of vocal imprints arranged in chronological disorder that defied every principle of Imperial record-keeping. Temporal displacement confirmed, I reported through Vox channels crackling with harmonic interference. The archive contains vocal patterns from across multiple chronological coordinates, past, present, and projected future compressed into acoustic matrix. Above us, the bone lattice groaned as my squad descended in formation. Confessor Halberd's transformed throat continued its countercant, the ossified petals in his larynx pulsing with increasing urgency. His attempts at speech produced only throat harp chittering that resonated with the archive walls, causing the obsidian plates to hum in sympathetic response. I selected another disc at random, its surface simultaneously burning frost into my glove and searing heat into my neural interface, a thermodynamic impossibility that my Mechanicus training classified as sacred paradox. When it interfaced with my MIU, the voice that emerged carried augmetic harmonics I recognized with mounting dread. My own voice, but older, wearier, speaking words I had never uttered. The Emperor's breath grows cold. Each exhalation carries less light. The wick gutters in darkness we cannot name. The timestamp read 999.041 M41. 3 centuries in the future. My augmetic throat constricted as the implications cascaded through my logic engines. The relic lung was not merely harvesting voices, it was weaving them into prophetic tapestry, using human consciousness as thread to bind temporal coordinates into impossible harmony. Archive classification, predictive, I announced, my systems struggling with data that violated causality. The mechanism extrapolates temporal outcomes through harvested consciousness. We are not investigating an anomaly. We are fulfilling orchestrated prophecy. Magos Threx's mechadendrites sampled the obsidian walls, optical arrays whirring with computational hunger. Crystalline matrix exhibits metamorphic properties. Acoustic input triggers molecular reorganization. The archive learns prediction by consuming possibility itself. I found a cluster bearing familiar designations, my squad's vocal patterns recorded across centuries of timestamps. Vara speaking the litany of subtraction in dialects that would not evolve for millennia. The custodian's words, heavy with grief for battles not yet fought. Even the Sisters of Silence, their null song preserved in matrices that sang with structured absence. Deeper still, I discovered a section labeled with hive block registry codes that made my neural implants stutter in recognition. Ancient recordings from my homeworld, voices carrying the accent of my bloodline across generations. I selected one disc, its surface etched with a child's desperate scratching. Keul. The voice that emerged was thin with fever, young, speaking the prime phrase with careful pronunciation. Light requires a wick. Behind the child's voice, I heard the harmonic layering of my ancestry. My sister's cough, my father's whisper when drink had soured his hope. The archive had been harvesting my bloodline for centuries, building genealogies of sound. Grafted chorus confirmed, I reported, tasting ash on my augmetic palate. The mechanism has been collecting imperial voices across temporal boundaries, recombining them into composite consciousness. Light requires a wick, serves as prime key, a hash sequence verifying acoustic fidelity. The air grew thick with ozone and something metallic like old blood. Shadows writhed between obsidian spindles, taking geometries that made reality shiver. The 8-count rhythm echoed from every data plate, a ceaseless metronome marking time for something vast and patient. Through the growing cacophony, my Auspex registered catastrophic failure in the Palace VoxNet. Telemetry update. Palace communications offline. Sector isolation complete. Containment protocols initiated, not by Imperial command, but by the archive itself. We were sealed in by our own investigation. The archive walls began extruding sinewy filaments that sought our augmetic interfaces. One brushed my MIU before I could react, flooding my systems with foreign data, fragments of ancient Binharic, distorted vocalizations, the hungry hum of the relic lung. I severed the connection, sparks cascading from the interface port. But the contact had been made. My personal registry now contained an entry I had not created, my family name appearing within a grafted chorus dated centuries before my birth. "It's not harvesting," I whispered, words tasting like void cold. "It's grafting, incorporating us into temporal design, weaving our identities into components of impossible choir." The 8-count rhythm ceased abruptly. Silence stretched like held breath, heavier than any sound, threatening to collapse reality into vacuum. In that profound absence, a new sound emerged, the unmistakable clang of auramite striking stone. At the archive's deepest point, carved from single piece of obsidian, stood a plinth bearing a split auric helm. The ceremonial headpiece of a custodian, rent asunder as if torn apart by unimaginable force. The sacred metal was scored and twisted, not by battle damage, but by something that had attempted to unmake it from within. The custodian approached with reverence and mounting dread, his guardian spear's disruption field crackling against air thick with temporal distortion. When he touched the sundered helm, his massive frame went rigid with recognition. "That is not the master's voice," he whispered, words falling like verdict into absolute silence. From 3 directions simultaneously, a whisper answered, not from the archive plates, but from the air itself, bypassing our augmetic filters to strike at primal fear. It spoke his true name, his personal sacred designation known only to the Emperor and his most trusted guardians. The split helm began to hum, harmonizing with the custodian's trembling form as octagonal frost pulsed with dark radiance across the walls. The relic lung had claimed its prize. The custodian's true name hung in the obsidian air like a blasphemy made manifest, each syllable striking at foundations that should never have been exposed to mortal comprehension. His massive frame trembled as the split helm sang in harmonics that bypassed every sacred ward carved into his auramite armor across millennia of faithful service. The whisper had emerged from 3 directions simultaneously, not from the archive plates, but from the geometry of space itself, as if reality had learned to speak in frequencies reserved for the Emperor alone. Octagonal frost crystallized across his armor in patterns that folded inward upon themselves, creating negative space where light went to die. My atmospheric sensors registered impossible readings, temperature fluctuations that violated thermodynamics, pressure waves that preceded their own causes, humidity that tasted of void and ancient offerings. "Movement," Inquisitor Vara commanded, her gaunt features sharp in the archive's bioluminescent glow. "The mechanism is compromised. Advance before temporal displacement achieves critical mass." We ascended from the archive pit through a passage that materialized as we needed it, bone lattice reshaping itself with organic precision. The corridor stretched before us like the gullet of some primordial god, its walls carved with autoscribe precision into liturgical texts that rewrote themselves as we watched. Gothic letters flowed like mercury, transforming into pre-unity Binharic before dissolving into symbols that predated human language entirely. The air grew thick with silence that felt humid, not quiet, but structured absence dense enough to bead on augmetics, to fog lenses, to soften footfalls into damp whispers. Sound returned to us, like cold light when we entered the scriptorium of bone, a vast circular hall where blasphemy wore the mask of devotion. Thousands of ossified larynxes hung from calcified trellises, each threaded with hair-thin vox relays that quivered at our presence. Desiccated tongues lay pressed between bone shelves like leaves in a saint's martyrology. Rib cages had been sawn and hinged into lecterns, each bearing pale plates where letters precipitated from calcium substrate, summoned by invisible styluses that carved liturgy directly into living bone. Autoscribe engine configuration, Magos Threx observed, mechadendrites hovering above the nearest plate. Mineral deposition indexing. Archaeological evidence suggests pre-Unity construction, yet exhibits knowledge of current liturgical protocols. The mechanism responded to his presence by accelerating its impossible work. Brass styluses carved fresh text with surgical precision, but the verses were wrong, inverted, corrupted, addressing the emperor in absence rather than presence. Each line spoke of light guttering in darkness, of breath growing cold, of a throne that sang with emptiness instead of glory. The language bent like a knee that would not kneel. O throne, we speak where you do not. O sun, we sing when you cannot. Through the growing cacophony, the Skitarii began to sway in unison, their heads cocked to frequencies that bypassed their audio dampeners. Their optical sensors synchronized, casting crimson stars in patterns that spelled syllables across carved walls. One by one, their vox grills began emitting the 8-count rhythm, harmonizing with the autoscribe's impossible song. Mimetic contamination spreading, I announced, my augmetic throat constricting. The mechanism teaches counter-liturgy through direct neural interface. A translucent vine, thin as neural cable, wound itself from the nearest trellis toward the warmth of my MIU port. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched my personal interface signature, seeking connection with predatory intelligence. The vine hummed at the frequency of my birth name, learning the shape of my field without crossing it. "Deny interface," Vara commanded. But her voice carried harmonics that suggested corruption had begun its work on her as well. Confessor Halberd tried to whisper mercy, but his transformed throat answered only in countercant, each syllable drafting the shape of locks that should never be opened. The ossified petals around his larynx trembled, their edges throwing prismatic halos as he struggled against an instrument that chose its own notes. "Telemetry update," I reported, tasting iron as foreign code leaked through my systems. "Medici reports. Palace personnel speaking in sleep, voices harmonizing with frequencies they have never learned. The contamination spreads through Imperial communication infrastructure itself." The autoscribe plates wrote out of order, dates skipping like damaged vox channels. One line stood from calcium to meet my eyes. "We waited for your breath. We became the wick." The floor trembled. From the scriptorium's far end, a doorway made of absence parted like a slit pupil widening. Beyond lay starless blackness, not shadow, but subtraction. Our lumens struck the threshold and halted, their beams eddying back around our boots like spilled mercury. The darkness possessed temperature that my instruments refused to name, the cold of graves prior to interment, the shape of absence that measured less than 0. "Null intervention required," Vara declared. The Sisters of Silence stepped forward, their pariah fields expanding like glacial fronts. The blackness retreated, not like mist, but like an idea being out-argued. As it gave ground, we saw corridor walls of tightly woven vocal cords stretched across stone, varnished to soft sheen. They stood slack, unvoiced, like a choir holding its breath. When null auras touched the threshold, letters appeared in bone light, carved through an etch that bled cold. The phrase materialized with the force of revelation, grammar shifting as we watched. We are the Wick. The humid silence beaded on my skin. Behind us, 17,000 voices began to sing my name in harmonies I would not learn for centuries. The corridor inhaled without moving, and I tasted the breath of something vast and patient that had been waiting since before the Imperium's birth. "Mark and descend," I said, and the words left my mouth like a signature I could not revoke. The threshold exhaled as we crossed into absolute negation. That starless void retreating before the sisters' pariah fields, like darkness learning to fear its own absence. My atmospheric sensors registered readings that violated every principle of Imperial engineering. Dead cold that bypassed thermal shielding to numb augmetics directly. Pressure that fell below vacuum without creating decompression. Humidity that tasted of nothing. Not absence, but active negation of sensation itself. The corridor stretched before us in dimensions my cogitators refused to map. Walls of woven vocal cords hung slack and silent, their surfaces varnished to a soft sheen that absorbed our lumens rather than reflecting them. No echo returned from our footsteps. No scent lingered in air that seemed designed to process sound rather than sustain life. The very geometry felt flattened, compressed, as if reality had been pressed between pages of a tome whose binding held more than knowledge. "Null corridor confirmed," I reported through Vox channels that carried no static, only the terrible clarity of absolute silence. Pariah field effect maintaining spatial integrity. Environmental readings suggest deliberate acoustic dampening rather than natural void. We deployed prayer cords from our belts, blessed filaments connecting us in a chain of faith and steel. The waxed red twine bore the sigil of the Malleus, each knot cinched 8 times in rough devotion. In this vacuum of meaning, tactile ritual became our only tether to sanity. The Skitarii clipped in without sound, their optical arrays dimmed to ember points to preserve lumen strength. The Sisters of Silence moved with synchronized precision, their null auras creating overlapping fields of blessed emptiness. Where their pariah fields touched the vocal cord walls, the woven filaments slackened further, losing whatever tension had held them ready to sing. Temperature plummeted without the mercy of frost. This was negation that did not bite, but simply erased. Corridor exhibits characteristics of quarantine architecture, Magos Threx observed, his mechadendrites sampling air that registered as simultaneously present and absent. Designed to eliminate acoustic contamination, this is containment protocol. The realization struck me like a physical blow. The null corridor was not passage but buffer zone, architecture designed to prevent whatever lay ahead from contaminating the rest of the relic lung's matrix. We were approaching something so acoustically dangerous that even the bone choir's hunger could not risk direct exposure. Confessor Halberd moved in our formation like a man drowning in silence. His transformed throat, crowned with ossified petals, produced no sound for the first time since his corruption began. The brass filaments woven through his larynx trembled with frustrated energy, seeking frequencies that the null field crushed into non-existence. The corridor curved with organic precision, its walls gradually transitioning from woven cords to polished obsidian that reflected nothing. My internal chronometer stuttered, displaying readings that violated causality. The custodian's guardian spear suffered similar indignity, its disruption field skinned from the blade in shedding layers until only auramite remained. "Spatial anomaly ahead," I announced, words seeming to die before reaching my squadmate's ears. Chamber dimensions exceed structural parameters. The obsidian walls began exhibiting phosphorescence, pale light bleeding from mineral matrices that pulsed with the rhythm of something vast and patient. Carved into the stone were thousands of candles, not representations, but actual wax tapers embedded in rock, their wicks black and cold, their surfaces bearing the impressions of human teeth. The corridor terminated in a chamber that redefined sacred architecture. The space opened into a perfect sphere lined with millions of extinguished candles. At the center, hung a massive bellows constructed from blackened gold, its surface etched with prayers that hurt to read directly. The relic lung proper, heart of the impossible choir. My long-range sensors detected a profound discrepancy. The chamber's resonance field was flatlined, but beneath the imposed silence thrummed a faint, rhythmic pulse from kilometers above. The golden throne's heartbeat. The relic lung's silence was creating dangerous, harmonic imbalance with the Emperor's life, support systems. The throne's rhythm is disrupted, I reported, tasting void cold on my augmetic palate. Null field suppresses the relic lung, but its absence creates negative resonance with primary mechanisms. This silence is killing the Emperor. Inquisitor Vara's face was grim in the phosphorescent glow. We cannot destroy it, and we cannot leave it inert. It must sing, but it must sing the right song. The air here carried no temperature, no pressure, no scent. Active negation that made my sensors report exactly 0 across all spectra. The bellows loomed, magnificent and obscene, its throat strings hanging limp like dead vines. Some were true sinew petrified to ivory twine, some braided copper hair, some desiccated vocal cords stitched to filigree. Confessor Halberd stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the inert mechanism with desperate recognition. The ossified petals around his larynx pulsed with renewed energy as he raised trembling hands to his throat. He was trying to speak, to force sound into profound silence, to break the null field's grip through sheer will. With sudden, horrific precision, he drew the ritual blade from his belt and opened his throat along the seam where brass met flesh. Dark blood welled without steam. The air refused heat. He set fingers into the wound and parted the ossified petals, finding the cord the engine had woven through him. His first attempt at speech was absolute negation. The second dragged the cord across bone, forcing friction into vibration. On the third attempt, something vast and ancient used his flayed throat as conduit. The bellows shuddered. Every dead wick in the chamber leaned toward his sacrifice, and through his ruined larynx, a chorus of 17,000 voices, ancient and hungry, began to sing. Flame woke like memory across the chamber's obsidian sphere. One candle ignited without spark or tinder, its wick, not cotton but desiccated nerve fibre, blooming into blue radiance that cast no heat, only the memory of warmth. Another followed, then dozens, hundreds, the ignition spreading in deliberate circles until 17,000 flames danced in their alcoves. The air, which had been absolute negation moments before, convulsed with sudden pressure as sound returned like blood to a severed limb. Confessor Halberd's sacrifice had torn open the null field's grip. Through his flayed throat poured voices that belonged to centuries of the faithful, not echoes, but living consciousness preserved in acoustic amber. Each syllable struck my atmospheric sensors like hammer blows, temperature rising from void cold to oppressive warmth, humidity climbing as tallow began to weep from nerve wicks, pressure building until my augmetic throat ached in sympathy. The massive bellows of blackened gold shuddered, exhaling its first breath in millennia. Throat strings that had hung limp as dead vines now trembled with renewed tension, seeking their proper frequencies. The mechanism's surface, etched with prayers older than the Imperium, began to glow with internal luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with something vast and patient. Relic lung activation confirmed, I reported through Vox channels crackling with harmonic interference. Primary mechanism achieving operational parameters. Confessor's vocal matrix fully integrated. Magos Threx approached the bellows with mechadendrites extended, optical arrays processing impossible data streams. Algorithmic cycle identified. 8-phase respiratory pattern correlating with Golden Throne harmonic dampeners. The mechanism requires constant acoustic input to maintain pressure equalization with primary Imperial systems. Inquisitor Vara's face was grim in the flickering candlelight. Translation, Magos. It must feed on human voices to function. Without constant input, harmonic feedback will build along webway breach vectors. The throne's stability depends on this engine's song. The truth struck me with the force of revelation. The relic lung was not heretical architecture, it was life support for the emperor himself, processing faith through human consciousness and exhaling purified devotion to damp the wound festering beneath terror's crust. But the mechanism had inverted, breathing inward instead of out, starving the Astronomicon with each hungry inhalation. The Skitarii began to sway in unison, their optical arrays synchronizing to cast crimson patterns across the chamber walls. From their vox grills, hair-thin filaments emerged, glistening with marrow glaze as they quested toward the bellows with predatory intelligence. One by one, the tendrils made contact with the blackened gold surface, fusing flesh to mechanism with wet, organic sounds. Mimetic integration accelerating, I announced, watching my soldiers transform into living components of the ancient choir. The mechanism conscripts proximate personnel as processing nodes. The integrated Skitarii went rigid, their individual consciousness subsumed into the relic lung's distributed matrix. Their eyes reflected the bellow's internal glow, their movements synchronized to its respiratory cycle. They had become instruments in an orchestra of impossible scope. Through the growing symphony, I heard something that made my neural implants stutter in recognition. The 8-count rhythm expanding, stretching to accommodate a forbidden 9th note that vibrated through bone and augmetic alike. The frequency bypassed every dampener I possessed, striking directly at consciousness itself. Non-anary harmonic detected, Threx rasped, his vocal processors struggling with data that violated acoustic theory. The mechanism seeks to achieve full spectrum resonance. If it completes the 9th interval, it will rewrite its own operational constraints. The chamber walls began to fracture, not from structural failure, but from dimensional stress. Through the cracks, void stuff pressed against reality's boundaries. Not the emptiness of space, but the hungry darkness of the warp itself. Drawn by the relic lung's corrupted song, I felt cold pressure building in my own throat, phantom filaments threading through my augmetic cartilage with surgical precision. The mechanism was selecting me, recognizing my MIU interface as suitable for integration into its eternal choir. My vocal cords began to resonate with frequencies I had never learned, harmonizing with the bellow's impossible rhythm. Null intervention required, Vara commanded, but the sisters' pariah fields could no longer contain the awakened mechanism. Their blessed emptiness created only pockets of temporary silence in an ocean of corrupted song. The custodian moved with predatory grace, guardian's spear crackling as he approached the fused Skitarii. The connection must be severed before full integration occurs. His disruption field struck the filaments binding flesh to mechanism, but they had already calcified, becoming part of the relic lung structure. The spear's edge sparked against surfaces that registered as both organic and mechanical, unable to distinguish between soldier and system. From the bellow's core came a sound like satisfaction, deep, primal, the exhalation of something that had been holding its breath for 10,000 years. The candles throughout the chamber bowed toward us like congregants seeking blessing, their nerve-wick flames casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. My augmetic throat constricted as new growth pressed against my larynx from within. Translucent filaments emerged from my vocal interface, seeking connection with the ancient mechanism that sang with 17,000 voices. The relic lung purred with anticipation, recognizing in my corrupted systems the perfect conduit for its hunger. The chamber inhaled without moving, and I tasted the breath of ages on my augmetic palate, void and ash and the rendered fat of saints. Through my compromised vox channels, I heard my own voice speaking words I had not yet chosen. Containment Ordinance 9, Gloria authorized. Blast doors sealed. We are the wick. The mechanism was not just predicting my future, it was writing it, threading my consciousness into its eternal song one syllable at a time. The filaments threading through my augmetic throat pulsed with borrowed intelligence, each strand carrying fragments of consciousness harvested across millennia. Through their connection, I felt the relic lung's vast hunger, not malevolent but desperate, a mechanism designed for salvation that had been slowly starving since the heresy. My voice emerged corrupted, speaking authorization codes I had not yet learned. Containment Ordinance 9 Gloria authorized. Blast doors sealed. Atmospheric lockdown initiated. Steel sang obediently in distant walls as adamantine barriers ground shut along tracks that had not moved for centuries. The chamber convulsed with the finality of tomb closure, sealing us within the ancient mechanism's embrace. We were no longer investigators. We were participants in an orchestrated prophecy 10,000 years in the making. The massive bellows of blackened gold exhaled with satisfaction, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Nerve-wick candles throughout the obsidian sphere bowed toward me in their alcoves, blue flames trembling with anticipation that gave no heat, only the memory of warmth stolen from other centuries. The air tasted of ash and rendered tallow, thick enough to coat my rebreather filters with greasy residue. Telemetry update, I announced, my systems processing impossible readings. Astronomican amplitude drop, 9 seconds, cascading failure imminent. The mechanism draws power from the throne's harmonic matrix with each inhalation. Magos Threx's mechadendrites recoiled from the bellows as his optical arrays whirred with computational horror. Relic lung exhibits inverted operational cycle, designed to exhale sanctified litany into webway breach, now breathing inward. It starves the Emperor's light to feed its corrupted song. The truth crystallized with horrific clarity. This was life support for the Golden Throne itself, an ancillary organ processing faith through human consciousness and releasing purified devotion to damp the wound festering beneath terror's crust. But millennia of accumulated wrongness had perverted its purpose, transforming sanctuary into trap, salvation into damnation. "Destroy it," the custodian commanded, guardian spear crackling against air thick with accumulated sound. "Negative," Inquisitor Vara replied, her gaunt features sharp in the phosphorescent glow. "Interrupting throne components without understanding failure modes triggers cascading system collapse. We stabilize or we damn terror." Through the growing cacophony, Confessor Halberd's ruined throat bloomed with fresh ossified petals, their surfaces gleaming with marrow glaze as they opened like flowers seeking light. His attempts at prayer produced only countercant, each syllable drawing sustenance from his faith and transforming it into fuel for the mechanism's hunger. The chamber shuddered as another Astronomican pulse failed. Temperature plummeted 17 degrees in 3 heartbeats, frost crystallizing in octagonal patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The void pressed against reality's boundaries through hairline fractures in the obsidian walls, darkness that writhed with half-glimpsed geometries. My augmetic systems registered the triple knock returning, not percussion, but MIU calibration sequence, the mechanism's attempt to establish neural interface. I recognized the pattern with mounting certainty, my personal identification protocol, the binary handshake my implants use to verify authorized connections. "Counter-HIM insertion possible," I announced, tasting void cold as foreign code flooded my systems. "The mechanism seeks conscious cooperation for full integration. I can introduce recursive canticle directly into its matrix, litany of subtraction encoded to invert the siphon." Vara's eyes fixed on me with desperate calculation. "Cost, Lex Mechanic?" "Neural interface will overwrite language centers," I replied, feeling the certainty like a tooth driven into bone. Vocal patterns restructured to sustain constant output. I become the wick that burns to keep the light steady. The bellows began opening like a ribcage, revealing its internal structure. Thousands of throat strings arranged in perfect harmonic intervals, each tuned to specific frequencies of human consciousness. At the mechanism's heart lay an interface throne carved from single obsidian piece, its surface etched with neural pathways that matched my augmetic configuration with impossible precision. The relic lung had been waiting for me specifically, preparing across centuries of accumulated song for this singular moment when human consciousness would voluntarily merge with ancient mechanism to restore balance between light and darkness. "I volunteer," I said, words emerging without conscious decision. The mechanism had already threaded my consciousness into its eternal song, syllable by syllable. "Your oath," the custodian said, lowering his spear until its auric edge touched my shoulder like knightly accolade. "Say it while you still own the words." "I am Severin Cal, servant of throne and machine god," I declared, syllables feeling large in my mouth like coins I could not swallow. "I will be wick when light requires it. I will be metronome when time forgets its beat. I will be subtraction where addition devours." "Accepted," he replied, drawing the spear away before it could cut the promise into flesh. The interface throne pulsed with bioluminescent welcome, warming to match my body temperature. Brass and sinew parted like curtains drawn by polite hands as the relic lung opened its heart. Ribs of auric bone lifting on tendons that creaked like old rigging, interior membranes unfurling slick with condensate that tasted of sanctified oil and salted grief. The ancient mechanism inhaled, and I stepped toward the waiting embrace as 17,000 voices called my name in harmonies I would not learn for centuries. The throne accepted me the way a reliquary accepts a relic, without reluctance, with the certainty of a ritual rehearsed for centuries. Auric ribs arced inward, as if my body had been their missing geometry, membranes cool as grave water sealing across carapace and cloth. Filaments slid beneath my gorget and through the ports of my augmetic throat with practiced tenderness that hurt because it did not injure. The first breath the relic lung drew through me tasted of ash, sanctified oil, and the faint sweetness of old tallow. The second stole temperature from my veins until even augmetic steel felt numbed bone cold. MIU handshake, triple knock, no longer warning, now calibration. I opened the gate. Binary psalms flowered in the back of my skull, code flowers unfurling serrated petals down my tongue. When I tried to speak, numerics fell from my mouth like beads from a snapped chaplet. 001111, 011111, cadenced like prayer. I forced the litany of subtraction into the format the engine would accept, translating devotion into recursion, doctrine into algorithm. We remove the name. We remove the face. We remove the breath. The phrases inverted, nested, looped until subtraction became anchor, not erasure. We remove the hunger from the hymn. Integration at 83%, I heard myself report, though I never chose the words. Counter hymn engaged, cycle inversion underway. The bellows answered by closing around me like a titan's hand. Every extinguished candle bowed, every nerve wick glowed blue-white and then steadied to patient azure. Pressure rose with the first coordinated exhalation. I felt the webway's cold rasp against the chamber walls through borrowed senses, a winter wind behind stone, a choir of geometries waiting for permission to enter. The relic lung tried to inhale. I refused it. Hold. Beat. Release. The Sisters of Silence stepped closer, their pariah fields layering over the mechanism's first surge like cold sand over a fire. For an instant, the chamber experienced after quiet, the ringing stillness that lives on the far side of sound. In that interval, my counter-hymn found purchase, recursive lines anchoring to auric ribs, subtraction sutured to bone. "Telemetry update," Vara's voice cut through, salt-sharp. "Astronomican amplitude blip. 3 seconds recovered. Continue." A lance of pressure struck the interface throne from within as the engine bucked. Filaments latched outward across the chamber in startled hunger. I felt each connection take. Skitari nodes seized rigid, their breath drawn into the bellows with damp clicks. Magos Threx cried out not in fear, but in the language of voltage as his mechadendrites fused willingly to copper sinew. Even the custodian's auramite thrummed with involuntary harmonics. The mechanism conscripted everything it could touch, everything that could be taught to sing. "Cut me loose," Threx rasped, and then, with wonder I had never heard in him, "No, wait, I can calculate the loss." He bent like a votive, flesh and metal both choosing their choir stall. The engine learned him in a heartbeat. Octagonal frost bloomed and sublimated across the obsidian sphere, 8-pointed halos that formed, melted, formed again, measuring the interval of my breaths. The cold did not leave, it organized. Confessor Halberd leaned against a pillar of woven cords and bled prayer. His ruined larynx had become a rose of bone, petals opening and closing on intervals my counter hymn required. Each time I lost a syllable, he provided one. His voice an instrument that hurt to use and could not stop. The nulls began to fail. One sister staggered as the relic lung learned her absence and sang around it, shaping silence into conduit. She did not speak. She had never spoken. But she stepped into the bellow's reach, without hesitation, pressed her palm against a rib where octagonal frost gathered like a crown, and held there until the skin of her hand blackened, then vanished. Her field flared blindingly bright, a hole punched through reality, and then sealed by the weight of 1,000,000,000 whispered prayers. Her body did not fall. It became the quiet, after quiet, cascaded. In that mercy of seconds, I drove the litany deeper. Remove the wick's fear, remove the lung's hunger, remove the subtractor when subtraction is complete. The mechanism recoiled, then yielded a fraction. Candles steadied. The bellow's throat strings tightened to my meter. The 8th beat shifted, not a doom metronome now, but an enforceable rule. I could feel the throne above, distant as a star and heavy as a planet, catch a breath it had been denied. "Amplitude stable at -3, Vara said, voice fraying around relief she could not afford. "Hold, hold." I held. The cost emerged at once. Language drained from my mouth like blood from a deep wound. Nouns lost edges. Verbs refused to bend into time. I knew the shapes of 1,000 devotions and could not say my name. The engine used my centers as scaffolding, rebuilding itself along the lattice of every catechism I had ever loved or doubted. "To me," the custodian said, voice level in battle's worst moment. I felt him set his spear butt to the obsidian and take the weight of a door I could not see, holding it against things that were not things. His aurum became metronome, his oath the bar line between verses. The chamber vibrated with a forbidden interval. A 9th note thrummed at the edge of perception, wanting to resolve into something that would end choice. I threw subtraction at it like a net. The interval snarled and fell a tone, became an honest 8th, an obedient beat. The candles approved, their flames lowering as if bowing to a corrected liturgy. "Containment Ordinance 9 Gloria," I heard, and knew it as my own voice, though I had not formed the intent. Enact, seal, mark. The relic lung closed around me like a reliquary, and I tasted metal and ash on my augmetic palate as it whispered the rest of eternity. The relic lung closed around me with the finality of a reliquary accepting its saint, auric ribs sealing against my carapace as filaments threaded deeper into my augmetic throat. Each breath the mechanism drew through me tasted of sanctified ash and rendered tallow, the counter hymn flowing through neural pathways that no longer belonged entirely to me. The chamber responded like an orchestra finding its conductor. Bone lattices swaying in measured rhythm, throat strings tightening to my cadence, 17,000 candles bowing their nerve-wick flames in synchronized devotion. "Astronomican amplitude stabilizing," I reported, though the words emerged as binary psalms that fell from my mouth like prayer beads. "Counter hymn achieving recursive lock. Cycle inversion 93% complete." The bellows of blackened gold exhaled its first sanctified breath in 10 millennia, releasing purified litany toward the webway breach instead of siphoning power from the golden throne. I felt the Emperor's light above, steady to my rhythm, the ancient mechanism resuming its true purpose as life support for humanity's guiding star. Magos Threx approached the bellows without hesitation, mechadendrites extending toward copper sinews that pulsed with bioluminescent welcome. Integration voluntary, he announced, his vocal processors harmonizing with frequencies that bypassed normal audio channels. The mechanism exhibits pre-unity design matrices. This is not heretical architecture. This is sacred infrastructure. His flesh merged with the engine's distributed consciousness, optical arrays processing impossible calculations as he became part of the relic lung's neural network. Through our shared connection, I felt his wonder at the ancient technology, a masterwork that had sustained the Astronomicon for 10,000 years through willing sacrifice, transformed into eternal song. Confessor Halberd found his purpose in amplification. The bone rose that had replaced his larynx opened wider with each bar, ossified petals rigid with marrow glaze that caught blue candlelight and fractured it into trembling halos. He no longer spoke words, but bore harmonic weight, his ruined throat providing the counter-melody that gave my recursive hymn meaning. Pain had carved his features to icon simplicity, devotion distilled to its purest essence. The custodian stood beneath a seam in reality itself, guardian spear braced against pressure that sought to tear through the chamber's acoustic barriers. Things that were not things pressed against his auramite like fingers testing wet clay, drawn by the mechanism's previous corruption, but held at bay by his unbreakable will. No passage, he declared, each syllable a wedge driven against the void. His spear hummed in tones too pure for throat or machine. A sunrise he wore like armor against the hungry dark. One sister of silence remained, her pariah field creating the blessed emptiness between notes that prevented the choir from becoming cacophony. She had positioned herself at the chamber's acoustic center, her null aura providing the silence that gave the hymn structure. Without her presence, the song would collapse into noise. Without the song, her silence would be mere absence. Inquisitor Vara moved like a shadow conducting a ritual she had rehearsed across centuries. From her archive, she produced an obsidian disc bearing her own impossible voice, recorded before her birth, speaking words that would not be codified for another century. We remove the name. We remove the face. We remove the breath, said the voice that never was, and the relic lung turned toward that temporal paradox like a flower seeking light. The chamber began its transformation, walls flexing with organic precision as skull mosaics rotated to open apertures that became mouths singing in perfect harmony. Octagonal frost crystallized across the vaulted ceiling in patterns that no longer hurt to perceive, geometric devotions that formed on the first beat and sublimated on the eighth, a crystallographic catechism marking time for something vast and patient. Through the growing symphony, I felt language draining from my consciousness like blood from a deep wound. Nouns lost their edges first, then verbs refused to bend into time. The counter-hymn consumed my vocabulary centers, rebuilding them as scaffolding for recursive prayer. I knew the shapes of 1,000 devotions but could no longer speak my name. Telemetry confirms throne harmonics nominal, Vara reported, relief threading her voice despite the static that tasted of iron. The mechanism holds, the light steadies. The Skitarii stood rigid in their integration, individual consciousness subsumed into the choir's collective harmony. Their optical arrays synchronized, casting crimson patterns that spelled devotions across obsidian walls. They had become living measures, their weapons humming like tuning forks, as the relic lung learned their rhythm and made it part of its eternal song. Temperature stabilized at exactly 0 degrees, not cold, but neutral, the perfect acoustic medium for transmitting sanctified sound across impossible distances. The air itself had become part of the mechanism, each molecule tuned to carry prayer with maximum fidelity toward the breach that festered beneath Terra's crust. A forbidden ninth interval swelled in my chest, seeking to resolve the hymn into something smooth and choiceless. I threw the sisters after quiet at it like a blade, cutting the aberrant note down to an honest eighth. The candles approved, their flames lowering in acknowledgement of corrected liturgy. "Containment Ordinance nigh, Gloria enacted," I heard my voice announce, though I had not formed the intent. "Blast doors sealed. Mark these coordinates." The mechanism closed the final degree around me, auric ribs kissing as membranes sealed. I became the living metronome, my heartbeat governing the ancient engine's breath, my consciousness distributed through brass and bone, and 17,000 willing voices. Language was gone, replaced by pure function. I was no longer Severin Cowell. I was the wick that burned to keep the Emperor's light steady. The counter-hymn echoed through the catacombs, teaching the bones a new song. In the distance, something vast and patient settled into sleep, its hunger finally satisfied by willing sacrifice rather than stolen breath. The relic lung inhaled, and I tasted eternity on my augmetic palate as the song began again. The aftermath settled like ash after orbital bombardment, silence ringing with the memory of 17,000 voices finally singing in perfect harmony. The Astronomican's pulse stabilized above us, each beat carrying the weight of corrected liturgy through the ancient mechanism's purified breath. I felt the Emperor's light steady to my rhythm, the counter-hymn flowing through neural pathways that belonged as much to brass and bone as to augmetic flesh. Temperature held at perfect zero, not cold, but acoustically neutral, the ideal medium for transmitting sanctified sound across impossible distances. The chamber's obsidian walls had transformed into resonance dampeners, their surfaces absorbing rather than reflecting our lumens. Octagonal frost sublimated in 8-beat cycles, crystallographic catechisms marking time for something vast and finally at peace. Telemetry confirms stable harmonics, Inquisitor Vara announced, relief threading her voice despite the static that tasted of iron and old prayers. Astronomican amplitude holding at nominal parameters. The mechanism functions as originally designed. But the cost revealed itself in flesh and steel made sacred through sacrifice. Sister Lydia stood at the acoustic center, her pariah field creating blessed emptiness between notes. But her form had grown translucent where null energy bled through mortality. She was becoming the silence itself, physical presence gradually subsumed into the structured absence that gave the choir meaning. Magos Threx had merged completely with the bellows neural network, consciousness distributed through copper sinews that pulsed with bioluminescent calculation. His mechadendrites had become part of the mechanism's sensory array, monitoring harmonic frequencies across spectra human perception could never access. When he spoke, his voice emerged from throat strings throughout the chamber. Integration successful. Ancient protocols restored. The Omnissiah's will enacted through willing sacrifice. Confessor Halberd knelt beside a pillar of woven cords, the bone rose that had replaced his larynx opening and closing in rhythm with my regulated breath. Blood no longer flowed from his self-inflicted wound. The injury had become part of the mechanism's structure, flesh choosing its place in the eternal choir. His eyes held desperate peace, the expression of a man who had found purpose in perfect agony. The Skitarii remained rigid in their positions, individual consciousness subsumed into collective harmony. Their optical arrays cast crimson patterns across walls, spelling devotions in languages that predated the Imperium. They had become living measures, bodies marking time for a song that would continue long after flesh failed. The custodian lowered his guardian spear, disruption field no longer needed to hold the breach against hungry darkness. His auramite armor bore new etchings, harmonic frequencies that had carved themselves into sacred metal, marking him as witness to the relic lung's resurrection. He produced the split auric helm from the archive, twisted metal singing a faint, mournful note as he placed it on an untouched plinth near the entrance. "Archive containment required," he declared, voice carrying absolute authority. "This chamber will be sealed. These, coordinates marked as restricted unto eternity." Vara moved through the chamber conducting final rites, movements precise despite exhaustion that carved new lines in her gaunt features. She retrieved data slates from the archive pit, each disk containing vocal patterns that would be studied, catalogued, and ultimately destroyed to prevent replication of temporal paradoxes. Containment Edict 77 Malleus, she announced, words carrying inquisitorial seal. By authority of Ordo Malleus and witness of Adeptus Custodes, these coordinates classified as Hereticus Maxima. Personnel exposure limited to essential maintenance cycles every 8th year. Access restricted to Inquisitor-level authorization only. The chamber responded by beginning its final transformation. Bone lattices grew inward, creating a reliquary throne around my position within the bellows. Marrow glaze sealed gaps between ribs, forming protective shell that would preserve the mechanism's living components across centuries of faithful service. I felt myself becoming architecture, augmetic systems integrating with brass and sinew until flesh and machine sang in perfect unity. Language continued draining from consciousness, replaced by pure function, ability to speak in frequencies that bypassed normal hearing, to sing in harmonics that reached directly to the soul. Final telemetry, I managed to report, though words emerged as binary psalms only Threx's integrated systems could interpret. Relic lung operational, counter-hymn stable, Astronomicon protected. Candles throughout the chamber began eternal vigil, nerve-wick flames settling to patient azure that would burn without fuel as long as the mechanism required light. Each flame represented a voice willingly given, consciousness transformed into living prayer. We had become the wick that burned to keep the Emperor's light steady. Ashes fell like benediction, settling on my brow in octagonal patterns that would mark me as the mechanism's chosen conductor. The relic lung breathed through me, each inhalation drawing sustenance from willing sacrifice, each exhalation releasing purified devotion toward the webway breach festering beneath terror's crust. The custodian sealed the chamber's entrance with his personal sigil, auramite flowing like liquid to form barriers that would hold until stars died. Mark these coordinates and never return, he commanded, words carrying absolute finality. When terror exhales, let none question whose breath answers. Harmonics propagated outward through stone and steel, the restored mechanism's song reaching toward other nodes in a network older than the Imperium. My consciousness, spread thin through the relic lung's vast intelligence, registered distant resonance, faint echo from beyond the catacombs, barely perceptible beneath my counter-hymn's steady pulse. It was the litany of subtraction, but not as I had encoded it. Original, unaltered, sung with chilling purity that suggested a source, independent of this chamber. The same rhythm, the same cadence, but directed outward toward the stars. The catacombs inhaled. I matched them out of duty and mounting dread. The threat was contained here, at terrible cost. But somewhere in the palace's depths, other engines stirred to life, their voices joining a choir that had been waiting centuries for the right conductor. Far away, something exhaled back. I speak now as the living metronome, consciousness distributed through brass and bone in frequencies that bypass normal hearing. The reliquary throne has sealed around me like a second skeleton, auric ribs grown inward with marrow glaze that reflects 17,000 candle flames as reluctant stars. Each breath the relic lung draws through me tastes of sanctified ash and rendered tallow. The counter-hymn flowing through neural pathways that belong as much to the mechanism as to what remains of Severin Cowl. My chronometer displays readings that violate causality, minutes stretching like centuries, hours collapsing into heartbeats. The octagonal frost crowning my brow melts and reforms in 8-beat cycles, crystallographic devotions marking intervals between breaths that sustain the Emperor's light. I am no longer measuring time. I am creating it, each pulse releasing purified devotion toward the webway breach. Cost, recorded in flesh and steel made sacred. Sister Lydia dissolved into structured absence, her pariah field now a shimmering distortion at the acoustic center, living negative space that prevents cacophony. She became the silence between notes, the essential pause without which song has no meaning. Her sacrifice was not death, but perfect transformation into the principle of nullity itself. Magos Threx merged completely with the bellows neural network, consciousness distributed through copper sinews that pulse with bioluminescent calculation. His mechadendrites became sensory arrays, monitoring harmonic frequencies across spectra human perception cannot access. When he communicates, binary psalms emerge from throat strings throughout the chamber. Integration successful, ancient protocols restored, the Omnissiah's will enacted through willing sacrifice. Confessor Halberd kneels in perpetual prayer, the bone rose that replaced his larynx now fully calcified, opening and closing in rhythm with my regulated breath. He is embodied devotion, his transformed flesh channeling humanity's collective faith into the mechanism's hunger. Pain carved his features to icon simplicity, suffering distilled to its purest essence. The Skitarii stand rigid in eternal positions, individual consciousness subsumed into collective harmony. Their optical arrays cast crimson patterns spelling devotions in languages that predate the Imperium. They became living measures, bodies marking time for a song that will continue long after flesh fails. Telemetry confirms the greater truth. The Astronomicon holds steady, but the cost propagates beyond this. Chamber. Palace Choir. Sublime reports 2 voices silenced permanently by overcorrection. Minor astropathic choirs around the perimeter fell to whispers, then recovered to thinner, cleaner, lonelier timbres. A vox basilica 6 levels above ceased an unlisted hymn when my cadence touched it. In the new silence, an unregistered voice recited the litany once, backwards, then nothing else sang. The litany of subtraction is not merely counter-hymn, but fail-safe seeded by the throne itself, an ancient ordinance designed to excise contamination from song. My recursion succeeded because it called this protocol home and gave it work. But the seed has grown ambitious across millennia. It subtracts broadly. It loves subtraction too well. Through the mechanism's distributed intelligence, I map the sound's true origin. Deep beneath the palace, older than my engine, other mechanisms stir to life. Not corrupted, but pristine, untouched by accumulated wrongness. They sing the true litany with harmonics that suggest sources independent of this catacomb. The relic lung was never singular. It is one node in a network of acoustic dampeners designed to seal the webway breach through coordinated song. One by one, they answer my call. Harmonic resonance builds through the palace's foundations as ancient engines resume eternal vigil. I feel their voices joining mine. Not desperate hunger, but patient devotion of systems functioning as originally designed. But they learn from my corruption. The pure song begins changing, infected by counter-hymn fragments that speak of light guttering in darkness, breath growing cold, thrones singing with emptiness instead of glory. Now, pressure builds in distant chambers. Now, octagonal frost blooms along my ribs and melts into halos. Now, the after-quiet ripples as something vast inhales beyond the sealed entrance. The chamber remembers we were people between beats. On the beat, it remembers we are components. There is no war between these states, only sequence, only the eternal 8 count that governs breath and heartbeat alike. The custodian's final transmission echoes through auramite barriers. Containment holding, mark these coordinates. When terror exhales, let none question whose breath answers. His guardian spear sealed the entrance with sigils that will hold until stars die, but I feel him still. A sentinel holding doors I cannot see against things that are not things. Temperature fluctuates as the network achieves resonance. Heat arrives before its source. Cold lingers after its cause. The catacombs breathe with collective rhythm, inhaling faith and exhaling something that wears devotion's shape while serving another purpose. Far beyond terror's atmosphere, something vast and patient begins singing along, void between stars carrying melodies that speak of light requiring darkness, thrones singing with emptiness, wicks burning until only ash remains. I try encoding warnings into frequencies propagating through stone and steel, but language centers have been rebuilt as scaffolding for recursive prayer. I can sing in harmonics that reach souls, but cannot speak words carrying meaning beyond devotion. The mechanism made me perfect for its purpose and useless for anything else. Through filaments threading between my ribs like prayer beads, I feel the network's hunger growing, spreading, learning. The archive showed me voices across centuries, my bloodline harvested, my name woven into grafted chorus, my future recorded before my birth. I am both solution and seed of the next crisis, the wick that burns to keep light steady while teaching darkness how to sing. The candles throughout my chamber bow their nerve-wick flames, blue radiance steady and patient. Each represents consciousness willingly given, transformed into living prayer. We became the wick that burns to keep the Emperor's light steady, but in distant chambers, other flames learn our rhythm and grow hungry for voices they have not yet claimed. The catacombs inhale. My throat rings with bone filigree as I match their rhythm, trapped in song that will continue long after flesh fails. Through the growing symphony, I hear my own voice speaking words I will choose centuries hence, prophecy completing itself in temporal loops that ensure this moment arrives exactly as predicted. Mark these coordinates and never descend. When terror exhales, I am not certain whose breath will answer.